The wind across the steppe carries many things. Dust from lands so distant their names have been forgotten, the scent of wild grass that grows where nothing else can survive. The cold that seeps into your bones and reminds you that this earth, this endless expanse of nothing, has swallowed armies and empires and left no trace of their passing. But sometimes, when the wind blows in a certain direction, when the night is deep and the stars are hidden behind clouds, it carries something else, something that makes even the oldest among us pause and listen, something that sounds almost like crying, the crying of children who were never given the chance to grow old. They were only children, sons and daughters of people who had made the mistake of standing in the path of the Mongol horde. Children who played in streets that would soon be ash. Children who knew nothing of politics or war or the ambitions of Khans. But in the chronicles of the Mongol Empire, their names do not exist. The scribes who recorded every victory, every city conquered, every tribute paid, wrote nothing about them, and what happened to them no historian dared to write. I was there, not as a warrior though I rode with the army, not as a general though I stood close enough to hear the orders being given. I was a scribe. My task was to record, to document, to ensure that the glory of Genghis Khan would be preserved for generations, carved into history with words that would never fade. I wrote of battles won and enemies vanquished. I wrote of the vast territories that fell under Mongol control, of the tribute that flowed from subjugated peoples, of the laws that governed the empire. I wrote everything I was told to write, but there were some things I was told not to write, and this is one of them. If you are still here, you are not like the others. You believe some stories should not remain buried. Stay and subscribe before this truth disappears again. The city fell on the 7th day of the siege. I do not remember its name anymore, or perhaps I have chosen to forget it. It was somewhere in the lands that the Persians called their own, a place of white stone buildings and gardens that grew fruit even in the heat of summer. The walls were high, the defenders brave. But bravery means nothing against an army that moves like water, that surrounds and suffocates, that has learned through 100 conquests exactly how to break the will of those who resist. When the gates finally gave way, the soldiers poured in like a flood. I stayed back with the other non-combatants, the servants and craftsmen and scribes who followed the army but did not fight. We waited outside the walls, listening to the sounds that cities make when they die. The clash of metal, the screams, the roar of fire consuming wood and fabric and flesh, and then, after hours that felt like days, the silence that comes when there is nothing left to destroy. I was summoned into the city the next morning. The Khan wanted records of what had been taken, what was valuable, what should be sent back to the homeland, and what should be distributed among the warriors as rewards. I walked through streets that were no longer streets, but paths between rubble. Bodies lay where they had fallen. The soldiers had already begun the work of sorting the survivors. Men of fighting age in one group, older men and women in another, and the children gathered in what had once been a market square, surrounded by guards who watched them with expressions that revealed nothing. There were perhaps 200 children, maybe more. It was difficult to count because they huddled together, the older ones trying to shield the younger, all of them silent, except for the occasional sob that escaped despite their efforts to remain quiet. They ranged in age from infants barely able to walk to adolescents on the verge of adulthood. Their clothes were torn, their faces were streaked with ash and tears, and they looked at us with eyes that held a question they were too terrified to ask aloud. What will you do with us? I had seen this before, in other cities, other conquests. The children were usually spared the immediate violence. They were too small to be threats, too young to be held accountable for their father's resistance, but they were also too numerous to simply ignore. So they were gathered, assessed, divided into categories based on age and apparent usefulness. The very young, those under 5 or 6, were sometimes given to families within the Mongol camp who had lost their own children. They would be raised as Mongols, taught to forget their original language, their original identity. They would become part of the empire not through choice, but through the erasure of everything they had been before. The older children, particularly the boys who were strong enough to work, were taken as slaves. They would tend horses, repair equipment, do the labor that kept an army moving across impossible distances. They would survive, if they were lucky and obedient, long enough to perhaps one day earn their freedom, though freedom in the context of the Mongol Empire was always conditional, always revocable. The girls who were old enough, who had begun to show the signs of womanhood, were claimed by warriors or officers, distributed as part of the spoils, absorbed into the vast network of captives and servants that sustained the army's advance. But there was always a group that fit none of these categories, children who were too old to be easily molded into Mongols, too young to be immediately useful as laborers, not valuable enough to be claimed as personal property. They existed in a liminal space, and I had learned through observation that liminal spaces were dangerous in the Mongol system. The empire valued clarity. You were either useful or you were not. You belonged or you did not. And if you fell between those categories, if you were neither one thing nor another, your fate became uncertain. Genghis Khan arrived in the afternoon. He rode through the ruined city with the casual confidence of a man who had done this countless times, who had walked through the wreckage of civilizations and felt neither triumph nor guilt, but simply the satisfaction of a task completed. He dismounted in the square where the children were being held and stood there for a long moment, studying them. The children fell silent. Even the infants seemed to sense that this man, this figure in leather and fur with eyes that looked through you rather than at you, held their lives in his hands. I was standing close enough to hear when he spoke to his generals. He asked about numbers, about ages, about what had been decided for them. The generals gave their reports. They explained the categories, the distributions, the plans, and then they fell silent, waiting for his response. Genghis Khan looked at the group of children who had not been assigned to any category, the ones who were between 7 and 12 years old. There were maybe 60 or 70 of them. They stood together, some holding hands, some crying silently, all of them frozen in terror. He was quiet for a long time, long enough that the generals began to shift uncomfortably. And then he spoke. I will not tell you exactly what he said, not because I have forgotten the words, but because there are some things that should not be repeated, some orders that should not be immortalized through repetition. What I will tell you is that after he spoke, the generals looked at each other. One of them, a man who had served the Khan for decades, who had carried out orders that would make lesser men weep, opened his mouth as if to question, but then he closed it again. Because you did not question Genghis Khan, you obeyed. The children were separated from the main group. They were told they would be taken somewhere else, somewhere better. The words were spoken in a language most of them did not understand, but tone carries meaning, and the tone was meant to be reassuring. Some of the older children did not believe it. You could see it in their faces, the understanding that this was wrong, that adults did not smile like that unless they were lying. But what could they do? They were children. They had no weapons, no power, no choices. They were led out of the city as the sun began to set. I watched them go. A long line of small figures, some stumbling, some being carried by older siblings, all of them moving toward the steppe that stretched endlessly in every direction. The guards who accompanied them were experienced men, soldiers who had been with the Khan from the beginning. They did not speak. They simply walked, leading the children farther and farther from the ruins of their city. I did not follow. I was not ordered to. But I heard things later, whispers among the soldiers, fragments of conversations that ended abruptly when someone realized I was nearby, and I began to understand what had happened, or rather, what might have happened, because no one spoke of it directly, no one confirmed, but the absence of those children, their complete disappearance from all records, from all conversations, told its own story. Some say they were taken across the steppes to distant camps where they were absorbed into auxiliary groups, trained for tasks that needed bodies but not identities. Others say they were given to subject peoples as gifts or tribute, dispersed so widely that they could never find each other again, never form any kind of collective memory. And others say they were taken to places where the steppe is empty and cold, where the ground is hard and unforgiving, where bodies disappear quickly under snow and wind and the endless passage of time. I do not know which version is true. Perhaps all of them are true in different cases. Perhaps none of them are. What I know is that those children, 60 or 70 souls, who had committed no crime except being born in the wrong city at the wrong time, were gone. And when I sat down that night to write my daily record, to document what had happened in the conquest of that city, I wrote about the walls breached and the treasure claimed and the resistance crushed. But I wrote nothing about the children, because I had been told not to. The army moved on, as it always did. There were more cities to conquer, more peoples to subjugate, more territory to claim for the empire that Genghis Khan was building, and with each new conquest the pattern repeated. Children gathered, children sorted, children distributed or disappeared. It became routine, normal, just another administrative task in the machinery of empire. But I began to notice something. The soldiers who had been involved in those disappearances, the men who had led the children away and returned hours later without them, those men changed. Not immediately, not obviously, but over time they became quieter. They drank more. They stared into fires at night, as if seeing things no one else could see. Some of them began to wash their hands obsessively, scrubbing their skin until it was raw, as if trying to remove something that could not be seen but could be felt. There was one soldier I knew, a man named Batu, who had been with the horde for over a decade. He was a good warrior, reliable, disciplined. But after one particular assignment, after he returned from leading a group of children out onto the steppe, he was never the same. He stopped eating, stopped sleeping properly. He would sit alone during the evening rest periods, rocking back and forth, whispering things I could not hear. I asked him once what was wrong. He looked at me with eyes that were hollow, empty of everything except exhaustion. "We obeyed," he said. "We were told it was mercy, that it was necessary, that the empire could not afford to feed them, to guard them, to deal with them. We were told it was quicker than starvation, kinder than slavery. We were told many things." He paused. His hands were shaking. "But mercy does not scream in the night. Mercy does not beg. Mercy does not cry for mothers who are already dead." He killed himself 2 weeks later, walked out into the steppe one morning and simply did not return. They found his body 3 days later, frozen, his throat cut with his own knife. The official record said he had been killed by bandits. But everyone who knew him understood what had really happened. He was not the only one. Over the years, I watched other soldiers who had been involved in those assignments fall apart in various ways. Some became violent, lashing out at anything and anyone. Some became withdrawn, disappearing into themselves until they were barely present even when physically there. Some simply vanished, deserting the army despite knowing the punishment for desertion was death, apparently deciding that any fate was preferable to continuing. And the women, the mothers who had survived the conquest, who had been taken as slaves or servants, who had watched their children being led away, they carried a grief that had no outlet, no resolution. They could not mourn publicly because mourning was seen as disloyalty, as a rejection of Mongol authority. They could not speak of what had happened because speaking would mean acknowledging. And acknowledging would mean confronting something too large and terrible to face. So they mourned in silence. I would see them sometimes, late at night, when they thought no one was watching, standing at the edge of camp and staring out at the steppe, at the vast emptiness where their children had disappeared. Some of them would sing, barely audible, traditional songs of loss in languages the Mongols did not understand or care to translate. Others would simply stand motionless, as if waiting for something that would never return. There was one woman I remember more clearly than the others. Her name was Anahita, or at least that is what I heard her called. She was from one of the Persian cities, educated, literate, someone who had lived a life of relative comfort before the conquest. She had lost 3 children, 2 daughters and a son. The daughters had been claimed by Mongol officers. The son had been in that uncertain category, the one that resulted in disappearance. Anahita did not weep. She did not rage. She simply stopped speaking. For months, she moved through her duties silently, responding to commands but never initiating conversation, never making eye contact, never acknowledging the world around her, except in the most minimal ways necessary to survive. And then, one day, she began to write. She had found scraps of paper, stolen or saved from somewhere, and she would sit in whatever corner she could find privacy and write. I never knew what she was writing. She guarded those papers carefully, hiding them away whenever anyone approached. But I saw her writing, night after night, her hand moving across the page with desperate intensity, as if she were trying to preserve something that was being erased. She died of illness during a particularly harsh winter. When they cleared out her belongings, they found the papers, hundreds of them, covered in writing. The officer who found them could not read Persian, so he brought them to me to translate. I read them, and I wish I had not. They were letters to her son, to her daughters, telling them things she had never had the chance to say, remembering moments from their childhood, describing the city they had come from, promising them that she would find them, that she would never stop looking, that she loved them and missed them, and that none of this was their fault. But interspersed with the letters were other writings, darker things, curses directed at Genghis Khan, at the soldiers, at the empire, prayers to gods to bring vengeance, and descriptions, detailed descriptions of what she had seen the day her son was taken away, the fear in his eyes, the way he had reached for her as the soldiers pulled him away, the sound he had made, not a scream but a whimper, as if he had already understood that screaming would change nothing. The officer asked me what the papers said. I told him they were prayers, harmless religious writings. He accepted this and ordered them burned. I watched as her words, her memories, her grief, turned to ash and smoke and disappeared into the same emptiness that had swallowed her children. I have carried that image with me for decades. The papers burning, the smoke rising, the erasure of testimony. Years passed. The empire continued to expand. Genghis Khan died, though his sons and grandsons continued his legacy, continued the conquests, continued the pattern. And the children kept disappearing, not in every city, not in every conquest, but often enough that it became an unspoken part of how things were done, an administrative solution to a logistical problem, nothing personal, nothing emotional, just efficiency, but the weight of it accumulated in the silence of soldiers who could not speak of what they had done, in the grief of mothers who could not mourn, in the absence of names, of records, of any acknowledgement that these children had ever existed. I am old now. The empire I served has fractured and reformed and changed in ways the Khan never anticipated. The conquests have stopped, the endless expansion has ended, and the world that the Mongols created, for better and worse, has moved on to other things, other concerns, other horrors. But I remember the children in the square. I remember the orders that were given and not recorded. I remember the soldiers who broke under the weight of obedience. I remember the mothers who wrote letters to ghosts, and I remember the wind across the steppe, carrying sounds that might be nothing but might be something, echoes of voices that were silenced before they could speak their full names. History will record Genghis Khan as a conqueror, as a builder of the largest land empire the world has ever seen, as a military genius who changed the course of civilizations. And all of that is true. But it is not complete, because history, as written by scribes like me who were told what to include and what to omit, is always incomplete. It is a shadow of what actually happened, missing the parts that are too dark, too shameful, too complicated to fit into narratives of glory and conquest. The children who disappeared into the steppe are not in those narratives. Their names are not carved into monuments. Their stories are not sung by poets. They exist only in the memories of people like me, people who saw and said nothing, people who obeyed orders and told themselves that obedience absolved them of responsibility, but it does not. I know that now. I knew it then, even as I chose silence. And that knowledge, that guilt, has followed me every day of my life. A weight that has not lessened with time, but has instead grown heavier, more insistent, more impossible to ignore. The empire grew, cities fell, his name became legend. But every time the wind crosses the steppes at night, every time the cold seeps into my bones, and I lie awake listening to sounds that might be real or might be memory, I hear them. The children, crying, calling for mothers who cannot answer, asking questions that have no answers, existing in the silence that history created for them. And I wonder if I am the last person who remembers, the last person who carries their story, and if so, what happens when I die? Do they disappear completely? Do they become nothing, erased not just from records, but from memory itself? I do not want that. I cannot allow that. So I have written this, not in official records that will be preserved and copied and disseminated, but in secret, in hidden words that I hope someone, someday, will find. Someone who will understand that behind every empire's glory is a cost that was never recorded, that for every victory celebrated, there were losses that were never mourned. That history as we know it is a lie of omission, leaving out the parts that are too painful to acknowledge, but too important to forget. If you are still listening, if you have heard this entire account, then their memory survived inside you. You carry their story now. You know what was done and what was hidden. You understand that the wind across the steppe carries more than dust and cold. It carries the voices of children who were never given the chance to grow old, children who were only children, who committed no crime, who were guilty of nothing except being in the path of empire. Leave a comment if you want their story continued. Subscribe before their voices fade again, because I will not live much longer, and when I am gone, you may be the only ones who remember, the only ones who can say that they existed, that they mattered, that what happened to them was wrong. And that silence, no matter how long maintained, is never the final word.